The training grounds of Gorath 7, a neutral military outpost, were alive with energy. Warriors from different species gathered for combat trials, testing their strength and skills against each other. It was a place where soldiers earned respect, or lost it forever. Among the crowd stood Threxel, a young Zervok warrior, tall and broad, with a powerful exoskeleton that shimmered under the sun. His kind was built for war, their bodies naturally armored, their strength greater than most species. He had fought many battles. But today, he sought a challenge. And standing in front of him was Darren Cole, a human soldier. Threxel studied the human with amusement. Darren's bulky, reinforced exosuit made him look slow and awkward. Zervok warriors never relied on artificial armor. They didn't need to. The sight of a human, wrapped in technology just to survive a fight, made Threxel laugh. "You humans always hide inside your metal shells," Threxel said, shaking his head. "Do you fear real combat?" Darren didn't react. He just adjusted the controls on his armored gauntlet, checking his suit's systems. His face was calm, unreadable. A few alien warriors nearby laughed, agreeing with Threxel. Humans were smaller, weaker. Without their advanced armor, they were nothing, or so the Zervok believed. Darren finally spoke. His voice was steady. "Let's find out." The challenge was set. A one-on-one combat trial. No weapons, only physical strength and skill. Threxel grinned. This would be an easy win. The match begins. A signal blared, marking the start of the fight. Threxel lunged forward, his speed far greater than expected for his size. His massive arms swung toward Darren, aiming to crush him in a single blow. Darren moved fast, faster than the Zervok expected. His armored suit absorbed the impact, and he countered with a precise strike to Threxel's ribs. The blow made a dull thud against the alien's exoskeleton, but it did little damage. Threxel smirked. "You hit like a child." He attacked again, this time with more force. His claws scraped against Darren's chest plate, making sparks fly. Darren barely dodged the second strike. The fight continued, each warrior testing the other's reflexes. Darren's movements were calculated, using his suit's agility to evade and strike where it mattered. But still, Threxel didn't take him seriously. The Zervok warrior laughed between attacks. "Is this all you have, human? That armor is the only thing keeping you standing." Darren remained quiet, his eyes locked onto Threxel's. Then, without warning, he stopped moving. Threxel paused, confused. The human reached for his suit's controls, and with a quiet hiss, the armor powered down. The moment of silence. Gasps echoed through the watching crowd as Darren stepped out of his suit. He stood in only a simple training vest and combat pants. No exosuit, no technology, just a human. For the first time, Threxel's smirk faded. This was a mistake, right? No human would willingly give up their only advantage. Without the exosuit, Darren was just flesh and bone. The fight should be over. But Darren didn't look afraid. He stood calm and steady, muscles tense, his stance firm. "Come on," he said, raising his fists. A strange silence fell over the training ground. The warriors watching weren't sure if they should laugh or feel uneasy. Threxel's hands clenched into fists. This human was either the bravest soldier he had ever met, or the most foolish. But one thing was clear now. The real fight was about to begin. Threxel's claws flexed, his exoskeleton gleaming in the sunlight. He stood still, staring at Darren, no longer protected by his bulky armor, just a human standing there with his fists raised. For a moment, the alien warrior hesitated. What could this unarmored human possibly hope to achieve against someone like him? But then Threxel's pride kicked in. A Zervok never backed down from a fight, even one that now seemed so absurdly one-sided. His hesitation turned into a slow, deliberate grin. "You think this makes you brave, human?" Threxel sneered. "You'll regret it." Darren's only response was a steady gaze. His breathing was controlled, his stance balanced. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. The crowd of onlookers murmured among themselves. Some whispered that Darren had lost his mind. Others began to doubt their earlier assumptions. Why would a human step out of his armor unless he had a reason? Threxel didn't care about the whispers. He only cared about proving his superiority. With a roar, he charged forward, his massive frame pounding the ground as he swung a heavy fist straight at Darren. Darren ducked at the last second. The Zervok's fist smashed into the dirt, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Before Threxel could recover, Darren twisted his body and threw a sharp punch directly into the alien's side. The blow landed cleanly against Threxel's armored torso, and the sound echoed across the training ground. While it didn't knock Threxel back, it made him pause. How could a punch from a human, without powered armor, have that much force? Darren didn't wait for him to process it. He stepped in again, faster than before, and delivered 2 more strikes to Threxel's ribs. The alien growled in frustration, swinging his arm in a wide arc. This time, Darren dodged by ducking low and stepping back. His movements were fluid and precise, as if he could anticipate every attack. The onlookers gasped. Threxel was missing his strikes, something that rarely happened in combat trials. His blows were powerful but slow compared to Darren's nimble footwork. "What's wrong?" Darren finally spoke, his tone calm but pointed. "Not so easy now, is it?" Threxel snarled, his pride wounded. He lunged again, aiming for a grab, but Darren slipped to the side and struck the back of Threxel's knee joint. It was a clean hit, and the big alien wobbled slightly before regaining his balance. It was becoming clear that Darren wasn't relying on brute strength alone. His every move was calculated. Every strike targeted a weak point. Threxel's exoskeleton might have been tough, but Darren's precision and timing were more than enough to make up for the difference in size and natural armor. The crowd fell silent. The laughter that had followed Threxel's taunts earlier was gone. Now all they could hear was the sound of fists hitting exoskeleton and the grunts of the alien warrior as he tried, and failed, to pin the human down. Threxel's confidence began to waver. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The human should have been crushed by now. Yet Darren was still standing, still landing blow after blow, still keeping his balance. "You think you're better than me?" Threxel spat, his voice dripping with frustration. "You're nothing but a soft-skinned weakling." But Darren didn't respond to the insult. He didn't need to. His actions were speaking louder than words. Threxel swung his arm in a desperate attempt to catch Darren off guard. For a moment, it looked like he might connect. But Darren ducked low and drove a powerful uppercut into Threxel's jaw. The impact made Threxel stumble back. He clutched his jaw, staring at Darren with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "How?" Threxel muttered under his breath. The onlookers couldn't believe it either. A Zervok warrior was supposed to be unbeatable without weapons, and yet here was a human, not only holding his own but gaining the upper hand. Darren lowered his fists slightly, breathing steadily. He wasn't just fighting with strength. He was fighting with experience, strategy, and something the Zervok didn't fully understand: human determination. The whispers from the crowd grew louder. They weren't just murmuring about Darren's skill. They were questioning what they thought they knew about humans. Threxel gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to lose, not to a human, not in front of the entire training ground. He charged forward again, claws extended. Darren stepped in close, slipped under the attack, and landed another clean blow to Threxel's midsection. This time, the alien warrior let out a grunt of pain. The force of the hit wasn't just a lucky strike. It was calculated, delivered at just the right angle. Darren took a step back, keeping his hands up, ready for the next move. He knew Threxel was stronger and tougher, but he also knew the alien's frustration was growing. Darren's plan was working, wearing Threxel down, making him question his own abilities. And as the fight continued, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a contest of physical strength. It was a battle of will. Darren wasn't going to stop. Not until Threxel understood what humans were truly capable of. Threxel took a step back, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. The heat of the battle was starting to wear on him. Zervok warriors prided themselves on their stamina and raw power, yet here he was, panting, frustrated, and unable to land a decisive blow against a human without armor. Darren, in contrast, remained calm. His breathing was controlled, his stance steady. There was a focus in his eyes that unsettled Threxel. It wasn't arrogance or overconfidence. It was the look of someone who had prepared for this moment, who knew exactly what to do. "You're slowing down," Darren said, his voice even. "And you're not as fast as you thought you were." Threxel growled in response. "You don't know what you're talking about, human." But Darren did know. He had faced larger opponents before, enemies who relied on brute strength and flashy displays of power. His training had taught him how to exploit weaknesses, how to stay patient, and how to let an opponent defeat themselves. The crowd around them had grown silent. The earlier laughter and jeers from Threxel's fellow Zervok warriors had faded. Now, they watched with wide eyes and tense jaws. The human wasn't just surviving. He was outmaneuvering their best young fighter. Threxel charged again, but his movements were less controlled, more desperate. Darren sidestepped and let Threxel's momentum carry him forward. Then Darren struck, his fist connecting with the alien's side. It wasn't enough to take Threxel down, but it was enough to make him stumble. "You call that strength?" Darren asked, his tone almost casual. "I've seen worse." Threxel felt a surge of anger. This human was mocking him, belittling him in front of his own kind. He couldn't let this continue. He clenched his fists and focused all his strength on one massive strike. If he could just hit Darren once, he would end this fight. But Darren was ready. As Threxel's arm came down, Darren moved. His reflexes were sharp, his movements efficient. He stepped inside Threxel's reach and delivered a quick, powerful uppercut to the alien's jaw. The force of the blow rocked Threxel's head back, and for the first time, the alien warrior felt pain, sharp and real. The crowd gasped. Threxel stumbled, his footing unsteady. He shook his head, trying to clear the dizziness. How was this possible? How could a human, without armor, hit so hard? Darren didn't let up. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew Threxel's confidence was breaking. "You've spent your whole life thinking your exoskeleton made you unbeatable," Darren said, "but you never learned how to fight when it really matters." Threxel roared, charging forward in blind fury. His claws lashed out, but Darren moved like water, flowing around the attacks. With each missed strike, Threxel grew more frustrated, more reckless. Darren's fists struck again and again, targeting the same weak spots. Each hit chipped away at Threxel's strength, his pride, his sense of superiority. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were silent, watching in disbelief. The Zervok warriors who had laughed at Darren earlier now looked at each other uneasily. Some shifted uncomfortably, their confidence in their own strength shaken. Even Threxel's closest allies had to admit what they were seeing. The human was winning. Threxel tried to rally. He growled, bared his sharp teeth, and lunged once more. Darren let him come close, then spun and drove his elbow into the alien's chest. The impact sent Threxel to his knees. Threxel looked up at Darren, his breathing labored, his pride shattered. He had always believed humans were weak, reliant on machines to even stand a chance. But now he saw the truth. Strength wasn't just about muscles or armor. It was about resilience, determination, the will to fight, no matter the odds. Darren took a step back, giving Threxel room to stand if he could. "You've got heart," Darren said, "but that won't carry you if you don't know how to adapt." Threxel struggled to his feet, his limbs trembling. He wanted to attack again, but his body wouldn't respond the way he needed it to. His vision blurred, and he dropped back to his knees. The silence from the crowd was deafening. They had never seen a Zervok warrior beaten this way, and by a human, of all things. Darren lowered his fists and looked at Threxel. It's over. Threxel knew he was right. He could feel the weight of his defeat pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, he had to face the reality that the Zervok were not the ultimate warriors they believed themselves to be. The human had shown them another way, one that relied on skill, strategy, and sheer determination. As Darren turned to leave, the crowd parted in silence, giving him space. The whispers would come later, spreading throughout the training grounds and beyond. The legend of the human who defeated a Zervok warrior would not be forgotten. And for Threxel, it was the start of a new understanding, a humbling lesson he would carry with him always. The training grounds of Goreth 7 remained silent long after the fight had ended. The watching warriors, alien and human alike, were too stunned to speak. Darren Cole had done something none of them thought possible. He had defeated Threxel, one of the Zervok's finest young fighters, without relying on armor or enhancements. Threxel knelt on the ground, his head bowed. His once confident gaze was now a mix of disbelief and reluctant respect. The human, who had stood so small in comparison, had fought with a strength and precision that left no room for excuses. Darren didn't linger. He stood quietly for a moment, his breathing steady, before turning away from the crowd. The tension in the air was thick as he walked off the training grounds. No cheers followed him, but no jeers rose either. It was a silence heavy with realization. In the warriors' barracks, murmurs started to spread. "Did you see that?" one alien asked. "The human wasn't even using armor." Another replied, their voice hushed as if speaking louder would break the spell of what they had witnessed. "It's not possible," one of Threxel's comrades muttered, shaking his head. He must have cheated. But even they knew there was no cheating in a trial like this. The fight had been watched by everyone, and Darren's victory had been earned fairly. The human soldiers present exchanged knowing glances. They had always been seen as the underdogs, the ones who relied on technology rather than raw physicality. But Darren's victory gave them a new sense of pride. It wasn't about being stronger or faster. It was about being smarter, more determined, and adaptable. Threxel eventually rose to his feet, the weight of the defeat still hanging on his broad shoulders. He left the training grounds without a word, retreating to the solitude of his quarters. There, he replayed the fight over and over in his mind. Every step, every punch, every moment of hesitation. For the first time, he questioned his own training. His whole life had been dedicated to strength, to brute force. The Zervok way was to overpower, to dominate. Yet Darren had shown him something different, something that made his own methods feel incomplete. That night, the other Zervok warriors gathered around their fire pit. They spoke in low voices, their pride shaken. Some dismissed the fight as a fluke, a one-time event that could never happen again. But others weren't so sure. "Maybe we've underestimated them," one warrior said. "Maybe humans are tougher than they seem." "They're just clever," another countered. Threxel wasn't ready for that kind of fight. But the arguments couldn't erase what they had all seen. A human standing alone, defeating a Zervok in fair combat. The legend of that fight would spread, not just on Goreth 7, but throughout the surrounding systems. Meanwhile, Darren sat quietly in the human barracks. His fellow soldiers wanted to celebrate, but he waved them off. He didn't see it as a time for celebration. For him, it had been a simple test of skill and strategy, not a moment for gloating. "You really put them in their place, Darren," one of his comrades said, a grin on his face. "I've never seen a Zervok look so lost." Darren shook his head. "It's not about that," he said. "It's about showing them what humans are capable of. We're more than just the armor we wear. They need to understand that." His words carried weight. It wasn't just about winning the fight. It was about changing the way the other species saw humanity. The next morning, Darren walked through the base as if nothing had happened, but the whispers followed him. Aliens and humans alike stepped aside as he passed, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. Frexel emerged from his quarters, his usual confidence dulled. He approached Darren in the open courtyard, where a small crowd began to gather. "I underestimated you, human," Frexel said, his voice steady but low. "I won't make that mistake again." Darren met his gaze and nodded. "Then maybe next time we'll both learn something." The two warriors stood facing each other for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. It wasn't an offer of friendship, but it was something close to respect. Frexel turned and walked away, and the crowd began to disperse. Darren didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The fight had already spoken for itself. Days after the battle, the atmosphere on Gorath 7 had completely changed. The trial between Darren and Frexel had become the center of every conversation. While the humans spoke of it with quiet pride, many of the Zervok warriors could not stop reliving that moment when their strongest young fighter had fallen. For some, it was a lesson they couldn't ignore. Frexel was one of them. Alone in the training arena one morning, he moved through his combat drills. His strikes were strong and fast, just as they always had been, but something felt off. His movements were too predictable, too direct. In his mind, he kept seeing Darren, not the human's armor, not the suit's powered punches, but Darren himself. The way he had moved, the way he had turned each attack into an opening for his own. Frexel had trained his entire life under the belief that strength meant everything. But the human had proven otherwise. Darren had shown that strength without strategy was just a wasted effort. Nearby, Darren himself was practicing as well, but his training looked very different. He wasn't striking at holographic targets or working on heavy equipment. Instead, he was studying movement, balance, and timing. He worked on dodging, on reading his opponent's body language, and on staying calm under pressure. One of the younger human soldiers stopped to watch. "Why aren't you focusing on strength training?" the soldier asked. Darren paused and wiped his brow. "Strength alone isn't enough," he said. "Anyone can be strong, but not everyone knows how to use it. The fight's won up here." He tapped his temple. The soldier nodded, clearly impressed. Darren's calm, thoughtful approach was something the younger recruits were starting to admire. They began to see that it wasn't about brute force, it was about understanding the fight itself. As word of Darren's victory spread, it began to reach other Zervok settlements. The idea that a human had bested one of their own in unarmed combat was met with disbelief at first, then anger, and finally curiosity. A few Zervok elders arrived at Gorath 7 to observe the human soldiers firsthand. They watched them train, noting their movements, their exercises, and the way they spoke to one another. One elder, a battle-scarred warrior named Krixar, approached Frexel after his morning drills. "Your loss has embarrassed our people," Krixar said bluntly, "but it has also taught us something important." Frexel looked down, his shame still fresh. "That humans fight unfairly." "No," Krixar said, his tone firm. "That we have grown overconfident. We have relied too long on our natural strength and armor. We have forgotten how to think." Frexel frowned. He had never considered this before. The elders had always taught him that their physical superiority made them the galaxy's best warriors. But now, even Krixar seemed to admit that this wasn't enough. As the days turned into weeks, a strange shift began to take place. Zervok warriors started observing the human training sessions more closely. They saw how the humans adapted, how they worked together, and how they used strategy to overcome challenges. Some Zervok even began incorporating new techniques into their own training routines. They practiced feints and counters, movements that weren't just about brute force. Frexel, once unwilling to admit his defeat, started to listen to these new ideas. He studied the recordings of his fight with Darren, watching every mistake he had made. Slowly, he began to realize that Darren hadn't just won with speed or agility. He had won because he understood the fight better. Meanwhile, Darren's own comrades began to notice changes in how the Zervok warriors treated them. There were fewer taunts, fewer dismissive remarks. Instead, there were respectful nods and even quiet questions about their training methods. One day, Threxel approached Darren in the mess hall. The other humans fell silent, unsure of what would happen next. "I need to know," Threxel said, his voice low. "What made you so sure you could win that fight?" Darren looked up at him, his expression calm as always. "Because I fought before," he said, "not just to prove my strength, but to survive. Humans don't fight for pride. We fight because we have no other choice. And when you have no choice, you learn to adapt. You learn to win." Threxel nodded slowly. He didn't respond right away, but something in his eyes had changed. For the first time, he understood what Darren meant. By the end of the day, Darren returned to his barracks to find his fellow soldiers in higher spirits. The shift in attitude from the Zervok had eased the tension on the base. Humans weren't just seen as weak anymore. They were recognized as equals in their own way. Darren didn't need the praise or recognition. He only wanted one thing: for his people to be taken seriously, not for their armor or technology, but for their ingenuity and resilience. And now, it seemed that even the Zervok were beginning to see it. The corridors of Gorath 7 felt different now. The unspoken wall that had divided human and Zervok warriors was no longer as strong. For the first time, they were talking, not just about battles, but about tactics, training, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. Threxel, though still quiet, was at the center of this shift. He had started to approach human soldiers in the training yard, asking questions. Darren, who had stayed humble since their fight, offered simple explanations without any arrogance. "Why do you practice those quick movements?" Threxel asked one day, watching Darren dodge a series of sparring blows. His tone lacked the mocking edge it once carried. Darren turned, catching his breath before responding. "Because the bigger the opponent, the more important it is to stay one step ahead. It's not just about avoiding hits, it's about creating opportunities." Threxel nodded, thinking this over. "In our culture, we're taught to stand firm and absorb blows. I never thought about using movement to control the flow of a fight." "It's all about adapting," Darren said. "You can have all the strength in the world, but if you don't know when and how to use it, it won't matter." The Zervok warriors who once dismissed humans began attending their training sessions. They watched carefully, taking notes on how humans balanced speed and strength. They started experimenting with their own movements, testing what worked and what didn't. It wasn't just a one-sided exchange. The humans learned too. They studied the natural power of the Zervok, seeing how they generated force and withstood punishment. In turn, both groups grew stronger. Threxel had transformed the most. The once proud warrior now trained with a mix of Zervok and human techniques. He practiced counters and feints, and when he sparred with other Zervok, they found themselves struggling to keep up. The changes weren't just physical. Threxel was learning how to think ahead, to read his opponent's intentions before they even moved. One evening, Darren and Threxel found themselves on the training grounds again. They weren't sparring this time. Instead, they stood side by side, watching a younger Zervok spar with a human recruit. The fight was even, each fighter trying new techniques. "It's strange," Threxel said. "A month ago, I wouldn't have considered learning from a human. Now I see that it's not about who's stronger. It's about who's willing to improve." Darren smiled faintly. "That's what keeps us alive. Always looking for the next way to hit better. Even when we lose, we learn something." Threxel glanced at Darren, his respect clear. "You're not what I expected, Darren Cole. You've given me a new way of looking at things." Word of the change on Gorath 7 started spreading. Warriors from other outposts began visiting, curious about the training methods that had broken the old stereotypes. Human and Zervok warriors sparred and trained together, blending their approaches and pushing each other to new heights. Elders from the Zervok homeworld came to observe. At first, they were skeptical, seeing their warriors adopt techniques from a species they had long dismissed. But as they watched, they began to understand. The new training styles made their fighters more versatile, more adaptable. Even the strongest traditions had to evolve if they wanted to survive. Darren never sought recognition for what had happened. He still trained every day, still approached each sparring match with the same calm determination, but others couldn't ignore his impact. The human who had once been mocked was now respected, not just for his strength, but for his mindset. Threxel, too, had changed in the eyes of his people. No longer seen as a warrior brought low, he was now considered a pioneer, someone who had faced a hard truth and come out stronger. His willingness to learn from his defeat set an example for others. He wasn't weaker for losing. He was wiser for accepting it and growing from it. One day, as the sun set over the training grounds, Darren and Threxel stood together again. The younger warriors were still sparring, and the sound of fists and grunts filled the air. Threxel broke the silence. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we fought. It opened my eyes." Darren nodded. "You can't grow without a challenge. Sometimes the hardest fights are the ones that teach you the most." Threxel held out his hand. Darren hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The handshake wasn't just a gesture of respect. It was a symbol of the bridge they had built. As they let go, both knew that things would never be the same. The barrier between human and Zervok had begun to crumble. They weren't just opponents anymore. They were allies, pushing each other to become better warriors, and perhaps better beings. Weeks turned into months, and Gorath 7 became more than just a neutral outpost. It became a place where warriors came not just to fight, but to learn. The once clear lines separating humans and Zervok were now blurred. The training grounds, once divided into human and Zervok sections, were now a shared space. Warriors of both species sparred together, shared techniques, and even began forming friendships. It wasn't just about combat anymore. It was about growth. Threxel had changed the most. He had once been known for his arrogance, for laughing at humans, and their reliance on armor. Now he was respected as a warrior who had faced a harsh truth and emerged stronger. His fight with Darren had not only humbled him, it had inspired him. One day, a large crowd gathered around the main arena. A new challenge had been issued, not between two warriors, but between two mixed teams. A group of humans and Zervok would face off against another mixed team in a series of combat scenarios. Darren stood with his team, his calm confidence steadying those around him. Threxel was on the opposing side, his expression focused, but no longer filled with contempt. The challenge began, and it was clear from the start that this was not the same Gorath 7 as before. The warriors moved fluidly, their techniques blending into something new. Humans used their agility to create openings, while the Zervok used their raw strength to capitalize on those moments. Threxel fought with a precision that surprised everyone. He was no longer just a powerful brawler, he was a strategist. He feinted, dodged, and timed his strikes with a skill that rivaled the best human fighters. Darren noticed the change. As their teams clashed, he saw how much Threxel had grown. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about thinking, adapting, and learning from mistakes. As the match continued, the crowd was on edge. Each side gained ground, only to lose it moments later. The warriors shouted encouragement to one another, not as rivals, but as teammates who respected each other's abilities. Threxel and Darren finally faced each other in the final round. The arena fell silent as the two squared off. "You've come a long way," Darren said, a small smile on his face. "Because I had to," Threxel replied. "You showed me that standing still wasn't enough." They exchanged blows, their movements fluid and precise. Each strike was calculated, each counter a reminder of the long hours they had spent learning from one another. Neither was trying to humiliate the other. This was a test of growth, a way to prove how far they had come. The fight ended with a mutual nod of respect. There was no clear winner, and none was needed. The crowd erupted into cheers, not for one side or the other, but for both. After the match, the atmosphere in the outpost shifted once again. The old tensions were gone, replaced by something new. The Zervok no longer looked down on the humans, and the humans no longer felt the need to prove themselves. Instead, they worked together, pushing each other to improve. Krixar, the Zervok elder, watched from the sidelines. "This is what we needed," he said quietly to one of the human commanders. "We grow stronger when we learn from each other." The human commander nodded. "It's not about who's better. It's about making each other better." As the day came to an end, Darren and Threxel sat on a bench overlooking the training grounds. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the base. Warriors of both species were still practicing together, laughing and talking as they honed their skills. "You were right," Threxel said, breaking the silence. "About what?" Darren asked. "About strength not being enough. You can have all the power in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, it's meaningless." Darren smiled. "And you proved that you can change. You took what happened in that fight and turned it into something better. That's real strength." Threxel nodded. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with winning or losing. It came from knowing he had grown, not just as a warrior, but as someone willing to listen and learn. Goreth 7 had become a symbol, a place where two different species had learned to see each other as equals. The humans and Zervok didn't always agree, but they no longer saw each other as lesser or greater. They were simply warriors, standing side by side, united by a shared respect for the fight and for each other.